Thank you.
I know.
Got it. You know, and even beyond that, there's been a lot of research. It's somewhat more recently, you know, the last several years, about what a lot of people call the wood wide web. And that's basically trees and other woody plants essentially communicating with one another, passing nutrients back and forth, signaling when, you know, extra defenses are needed against pest invaders and that sort of thing, via underground root connections and even the mycorrhizal fungi that help those root connection, facilitate those root connections. So, you know, really, when you step back and think about it, the soil, a healthy soil, that's so pivotal to all of these interconnected, you know, facets of a healthy woodland, and a healthy, you know, yard if you do it right. So how do we support those healthy soils? There's a few ways. One is to be less tidy, obviously. You know, fall is come and gone now, but a really, really great way to support those little critters in the soil, regulate temperature, build new soil and compost. You know, you see the fungi in here of various kinds, the leaf litter, decomposing wood, even some seeds, this decorative pillow. And certainly if you peeled any of this back, you'd see all kinds of life frantically scrambling to get back into the nooks and crannies. That is what healthy soil looks like. Is that practical to have all over your front yard? Probably not. But as people who want to be more responsible about our impact on the earth, we can make room for these sorts of areas around our properties when, you know, we have the chance. Backyards are great for that. Landscape beds are great for that. Really just less tidy, less manicured, less traditional. The more you can lean into that, the better off, you know, your overall small pocket of earth is going to be, you know, in terms of benefiting wildlife. So we talked a little bit pre-talk, I guess, about junk trees, and another thing that I'm constantly arguing in favor of as a urban forester are dead trees. There's not a lot of room in our urban environments around people and homes and brand new Mercedes for dead trees, because obviously dead trees pose a greater risk of falling over than a living healthy tree. However, that risk I find is generally widely overstated. And there are ways you can work around dead trees to make them both safer to, you know, live beneath, and also still have them offer some of those wildlife benefits. Something that we've really focused on in Novi lately is if a dead tree is posing risk to a person's home or something like that, obviously we don't want that to fall on their head. So a lot of times we will cut off the upper portion of it, leave the lower 15 feet or so to stand. And as that dead tree continues to stand there, it's going to continue to decay. Insects are going to move in, which is going to draw in this fella to pick those out. Cavities are going to develop, which supports a lot of cavity nesting birds and mammals. And of course, you know, this tree is going to continue to decompose, shed its bark, shed its branches. Those will all sort of break down into the soil. And dead trees with loose bark are actually really, really important roosting habitat for bats as well. So much so that there are certain laws in place prohibiting the removal of habitat trees during, you know, their breeding season if it's in one of those pockets with where endangered species are known to be active. So, you know, dead trees, yes, they do carry an inherent risk. Yes, we need to act on that risk in the presence of people. But if this tree here is way in the back of your property, you never really even walk back there except to maybe mow it or get something out of the shed, and it's not going to hit a permanent target like your home, the street, your children, then that tree can probably stay standing, provide all those good wildlife benefits that we talked about. And likewise, you know, I mentioned cutting off the top, reducing that risk to a low acceptable level of risk, and allowing the rest of that tree to be habitat. So any opportunity we get in Novi to facilitate that is one that we are likely to take advantage of, because again, dead trees, snags, that sort of thing are very rare in our built environments. So now jumping more into the actual planting and species diversity side of this talk, I wanted to mention this guy is a professor of entomology, that's the insect one, at University of Delaware. His name is Doug Tallamy. He's written several books, 4 maybe. This is kind of the first one that got me down this path of an interest in native plants, bringing nature home. He's got a couple other books on the topic as well. But he basically approaches expanding native plant diversity from a perspective of an entomologist. So his laser focus is on how does this impact the insect population and insect population diversity for this person's yard. And that's how they started the Homegrown National Park movement, which is basically the idea that there's not going to be any sweeping legislation that turns all of Michigan into a national park that can never be developed again. So we have to act within the constraints that are currently on our, human society. One of the ways you can act as an individual to, make a difference in your, the health of your planet, the health of your local wildlife and ecology, is to treat your own property, or even one little corner of your own property, or even the deck outside of your apartment as a homegrown national park by planting native plant species, a variety of them that support a variety of native insects, which of course form the bedrock of food webs around here. These headlines are everywhere, and you as environmentally minded folks probably are aware that research is showing that insect populations have plummeted pretty significantly. This figure said declined by 45% since 1974. That's not all that long ago, and that's an extreme drop. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that play into that. Pesticide use has exploded, changing climate, all that sort of thing, everything that comes along with that. One that's really, also a really big factor, but easier for us to wrap our hands around, at least here in our own pockets and our own properties, is habitat loss. We can immediately make improvements to support insects through proper habitat on our properties, whereas those other problems, while still very real and very terrifying, are much bigger and harder to wrap our hands around as individuals. So one more point on lepidopterans. That's basically like butterflies and moths, the caterpillars that become butterflies and moths. There are about 180,000 species on Earth. We've got just over 800 of them here in Michigan. Those really play an outsized role in the local food webs. Again, I was giving this talk for bird people, so coming up, you got some bird facts coming. They're a really, really high value prey item, right? Because you think about, let's say, a caterpillar is this big, plump, juicy thing full of fats and proteins and all that good stuff that can really help, animals grow, help them survive and build up, protective fat through the winter, whatever they have to do, help on migratory flights where they need that really high energy diet. Contrast that against something with like, some kind of beetle with a really hard chitinous exoskeleton that's hard to digest. There's not really as much, meat in there to get at. So it's a much lower value prey item than these vital lepidopterans that I mentioned. This really kind of surprised me. I did not expect this at all when I found this. I think this was in Tallamy's book. It takes about 9,000 caterpillars to raise a single clutch of chickadees to maturity. This is a chickadee. It's a very small bird. It would fit pretty comfortably in the palm of your hand. And again, 9,000 caterpillars to raise a single clutch of those things and get them to a successful adulthood. So if we want animals like this to continue to exist, then we need a whole lot of insects like this to be supported in our homegrown national parks. Also, obviously lepidopterans, many of them pollinate many, many plants. There's been a really good movement to celebrate pollinators, support pollinators, etc. A lot of that focus has gone to charismatic species, many of which are exotic bumblebee and honeybee species that, while they do a lot of work to pollinate, it'd sure be nice to get some shine for our native pollinators too, and stuff that's outside of that, vespid family. So these lepidopterans are a good, spotlight on that. I want to talk about this website. I can maybe drop this in the chat later on. It's a link basically to this website that Talamy and some of his research assistants built. And it lets you put in your zip code. For me, that's 48185. And then it spits out every native plant genus. Usually it goes to genus, and then sometimes it'll go all the way down to species. And how many Lepidopteran species they support in this area. So it's super hyper local, and it's a great resource when you're looking for native plants to stick around your yard. Because the reality is that not all native plants are created equally. And by that, I mean they don't all carry the same degree of benefit. These are figures pulled from that website I just referenced. And these are really some of the more keystone species, meaning they really have an outsized effect on the environment around them. The best thing you can do for so I mentioned that I'm a city forester, I'm a certified arborist, blah, blah, blah. My favorite species beyond all others is a white oak, but any old oak will do for me. It's got super strong wood. It lives a really long time. They get huge, so they have all those nice carbon sequestration and shade benefits and stormwater interception, blah, blah, blah. Throw that all aside, it also supports the most diverse array of Lepidopteran species here in Michigan. And honestly, throughout much of the United States, it's the same. Oak is and Quercus is an extremely diverse genus. It supports an extremely diverse, array, like I said. You can kind of burn down the list here. There's a couple others, including some trees that maybe are not so popular sometimes with some folks. Cherries and aspens being those two. Up here, it also actually, something really cool about the site is it also has herbaceous species. So goldenrod is huge, native strawberry, the native sunflower here, Joe Pieweed, which is what you're seeing here. It doesn't just list these top 5 either. It's like a whole big list, the number of species, and even it will give you the types of species that your native plants may support. So this is the birch genus. It goes down to specific species here, paper birch, yellow birch, blah, blah. And then gives you even the butterflies you can watch out for because their caterpillars may use this plant as a host species. I should talk briefly about what it means to be a host species, just in case anybody's not, up to speed on that. There's such a thing as a generalist, and there's such a thing as a specialist, very broadly and vaguely when we're talking about different animals and insects, wildlife. Generalists can eat on a whole lot of different things. You might think of some of the species you see more commonly, different squirrels, American robins, that sort of thing. They can really make their living pretty well around humans because they can eat a variety of different, forage and make their nesting habitat in a variety of different areas and that sort of thing. The specialists are not so lucky, and those tend to have a much harder time living amongst people. And if you haven't noticed, people are everywhere, and the population only seems to continue to grow. So the specialists are really the ones that feel much more, severe impact from habitat loss, people spreading around, development, all those things. What a host plant is to an insect, to a caterpillar, we'll talk about specifically here, they can only feed on that host plant. The mandibles or the digestive process within them is unable to process any other type of plant. A good example of that is something called the spice bush swallowtail. That's a butterfly around here. Its caterpillars are only able to feed on spice bush. I think that's Lendera benzoin, I think. So there's no spice bush swallowtail. That species is gone. So that drives home. Oh, sorry, I thought I was moving on to a different point. We will revisit that in just a second, but that's basically the host plant and relationship with some of these insects. Again, I talked briefly about the myth of junk trees before this talk. I get a lot of calls from residents that are upset about the honey locust roots that are destroying their lawn because they, are very aggressive, admittedly, and tend to poke up above the surface. And I have to mow around them. That's a big problem for me. And I hear a lot from residents that have cottonwood seeds that clog their pool filter and they have to scrape them out. And of course, it kind of goes on. Aspen are really unpopular to a lot of people too, just because they tend to send up a lot of shoots. These junk trees that people want to see gone, these dead trees that we already covered, they're also really vital to a lot of these ecological processes we talk about. For example, aspens are host to 367 lepidopteran species. Box elder, they have those box elder bugs. Their growth form tends to be crazy. They grow super fast. They sucker like crazy. But guess what? They also are a host plant to 281 lepidopteran species, and the honey locust, which I talked about with its roots, 43 species. So even these trees that are unpopular for various reasons, the dead trees that I already covered, they really have so much to offer us, not just in the typical traditional way of, providing shade, sequestering carbon, cleaning up air pollution, all those things. It's also really, really vital that these native trees be supported when they're often slagged, so that they can provide these good benefits to these insects that, again, build the foundation to our local food webs here. I touched on this a little bit 1 second ago. Again, the generalists are not the ones feeling the greatest brunt of habitat loss. It's the specialists, the spicebush swallowtail, for example, again, that really could use the support more so than, the squirrels that are climbing all over the walnut tree in my backyard, I'm sure, all the time. So now that we're getting into spring, obviously this is a really good time to plant. A lot of plant exchanges are going on right now. There's a lot of, different organizations are putting together native plant sales or native plant exchanges. Nurseries are starting to open back up again. So it's a really good time to plant. I always urge people, because this is a big part of my job, so it's always kind of on my mind, that you need to plant the right tree in the right place. We want to be good stewards of the land and plant native species that'll support this wildlife, but we probably don't want to stick that white oak I talked about directly under power lines that are hanging 20 feet above our heads. It's just going to become a conflict. It's never going to work out. And unfortunately, that tree is probably going to need to be cut down long before it ought to have been, because of some bad planning. So in addition to potential utility or infrastructure conflicts, don't plant a big tree right next to your house. It's really common in Novi for some reason, and it always leads people to heartache. You want to think about not what does this tree look like right now? What is it going to look like at its listed max height, max spread, and do I have room for that? You also, of course, have to think about soil condition and light requirements. Don't plant a sun-loving species in the shade. You're just going to get frustrated because it's either not going to grow very fast at all, or it's ultimately going to die. Around me, we have pretty heavy clay in the soil, so we always have to keep that in mind when we're choosing species. So again, this tree that you're planting, for example, you want this tree to outlive you. You want this tree to outlive me. Ideally, it should outlive our children. So let's put an extra, half hour into planning to make sure this is the right tree for the right place, and stick it in, set it up for success, rather than just rushing it and leading to all kinds of problems down the road. this is more along the lines of what I was just talking about. You can really help trees out a lot by just spending a little bit of extra money. It doesn't take a lot to make sure that trees are properly mulched. Um, we talked about those really healthy soils, that picture that had all the breaking down, the decomposing wood and leaves and all that good stuff, all the activity in there. Again, it's hard to replicate that, especially in a short period of time in an urbanized area like this. So one way you can start to simulate that pretty well is to put down about a 2-inch layer of mulch. You want to make sure it's pulled back from the base of the tree. If it's piled up right against the trunk, if it looks like a telephone pole entering the ground and there's no flare for where the roots flare out, then that tree is ultimately going to drown or not get enough air, etc. But if you pull that mulch back so you can see the root flare, water will pool down there, get down to the roots where it's needed, and you won't run into those issues with rot. Young plants are also really vulnerable to browsing. We have so many deer around here in Michigan, and they can take 2 years of growth on that new shrub you put in the backyard and basically cut it down to nothing overnight. So you can save yourself some of that heartache by, this is a pretty elaborate fence. You don't even necessarily have to go this hardcore, but having some kind of protective fencing up will really, reduce the risk of herbivores browsing until at least the thing has grown up enough to take some damage. And then, if they want to get a nibble, then go ahead. And of course, the biggest reason that the trees that, 9 times out of 10, when we plant a tree for the city of Novi, it dies because it didn't get enough water or because it was planted too deeply. So really focus on that planting depth, and then make sure that you have a plan to keep this tree watered, this tree, shrub, whatever you're planting watered. It's really hard to get roots established when things are very small and their root system is very restricted. Oftentimes when you're planting larger stock, a lot of roots are cut off in preparation to get that root ball in the ground, or containerized plants may not have good root structure because they grow outward, hit the walls, and then start to curve around. So it's best to cut some of those off sometimes. But immediately, as soon as you stick a tree in the ground in a new spot, it's going to be undergoing a lot of stress. And one way you can really curb that significantly is by making sure it's adequately watered. This is kind of a quick diversion here because I just want to briefly mention invasive species. I bought this house I'm sitting in a few years ago, and immediately I noticed that there was a decent amount of glossy buckthorn in the back. Buckthorn is a woody invasive species that really forms dense thickets. Unfortunately, it's super common in Michigan. We spend tens of thousands of dollars removing it from Novi woods every year. A lot of other communities are doing the same. It actually has allelopathic compounds, so not only does it grow so densely that it's shading out diverse species, but it's also shooting chemicals down through its roots and decaying leaves into the soil to reduce the likelihood of new and different plants germinating. So it really does a lot to suppress that native or just plant diversity in general that we're trying to foster. There's a short list of kind of infamous woody invasive species around here that, again, we spend a lot of money fighting in Novi. Autumn olive, the buckthorn I mentioned, multiflora rose, invasive barberry, and invasive honeysuckle. Until pretty recently, you could buy a lot of these in nurseries still, especially the honeysuckle. Today, you can still go buy a flowering pear tree, Caloriparis pyrus caloriana, I think is how you say that. Those just got banned in Ohio. They are in the process of being banned in a couple other states. They have a ton of invasive qualities that make them a really terrible choice. And probably where a lot of you guys are too, we just had a couple of very bad winter storms about a month ago. And, we in Novi spent about the entire month cleaning up that storm damage, down trees, down limbs, etc. Like 70% of the debris we picked up was from those flowering pear trees. They grow with terrible form. They have weak wood. They have a ton of problems. You can still go to Home Depot and buy them. So, that's not something that's going to pop up on that native plant finder website I shared. That's a really good resource to make sure you're not accidentally doing some harm with your plantings by sticking one of these or allowing one of these to prosper, whereas you could replace this with something native and really be doing a lot of good as opposed to this ecological harm. Oh, wait, one more thing I want to touch on. Some invasive species were planted with good intentions because they thought, hey, these grow fruits. The birds love these fruits. That's going to be, really good for them for habitat. Some generalists, some of those generalists we talked about may feed on invasive fruits. You see it with buckthorn a lot, but they don't actually provide very complete nutrients. It's, it's not that big chunky caterpillar full of proteins and fats. It's just, this is, something packed with sugar that's going to fill my belly, but not really feed my young and allow for this clutch to grow up healthy. So they'll feast on those invasive fruits because they're everywhere. And then that, of course, goes through the bird's system, gets pooped out onto the ground. And what do you know, that helps with their dispersal. So that's what we see here. They're perched on some buckthorn. That is an old buckthorn berry there. I think those are cedar waxwings. I gave this talk to bird people. I'm not the biggest bird person. Not that I don't like them, I just am not hugely educated on it. So cedar waxwings, I think. Ultimately, the things I want you guys to remember here are, the importance of supporting native wildlife, beginning with, native species being planted around our properties, where we can go out, stick our hands in the dirt, and affect change very, very rapidly. Again, Jerry off top mentioned some marches, doing some different, more, broader, large scale, affecting some change at that level. That's important too. This is easy to wrap your hands around. You can order native plants tomorrow and plant them at the end of the week. It's warming up a lot. It's getting to be planting time. You can start this change now. Begin by reducing grass. Grass, like I said, is pretty akin to ecological deserts in a lot of places. Doesn't provide much wildlife benefit. There are a lot of better choices that integrate vertical space, cast shade, all that good stuff. And embrace the mess of, probably not going to get to this level where you have inches of leaf litter and good decomposition going on, but this is allowed to live behind the shed or in the backyard or in the landscaping beds around the property. And that really helps support that healthy soil, which builds strong plants, which supports those food webs that we want to develop. Plant native species, of course, that's going to have the largest impacts, the greatest benefits to your local wildlife. Again, that website is Native Plant Finder. That's what I always punch into Google when I have to find it if it's not bookmarked, but I will try to drop that link in the chat as well. And that is your resource for all of the native plants in your zip code and the number of lepidopterans that they support. Again, those lepidopterans are chosen because they are a good indicator species and they have a really outsized impact on the food web because they are such a high value prey item. And then finally, we want to control invasive species because more invasive species means less overall plant diversity, and less diversity is obviously bad for supporting strong biodiverse food webs. I think that's all I've got. That's the end. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer them. Thanks so much for listening to me blather on, and I yield my time.
Sure. If anybody has a question, feel free to unmute and ask it.
Hi, I have a couple questions actually.
Sure.
I live in Royal Oak, and being where we're located, there tends to be like mice and rat problems. Does keeping the mess, like the leaves on the grass and not cleaning up, from the fall, does it encourage mice and rats to like take up residents?
Yeah, so from what I understand, that's more to do with a food availability problem.
Oh, okay.
They are going to nest in something, right? So whether that is the pile of sticks behind the garage or someone's attic, etc., they are probably going to benefit from some of that mess I talked about. I think there's still a way to do it responsibly that will provide plant benefits, not make your neighbors hate you, etc. For example, I've got several. I mentioned I bought this house a few years ago. I've been year by year reducing the grass around this place. Built some landscape beds, and basically every time a big branch falls out of the elm tree in the front yard, again from these storms we've had, I take it out back, I throw it in the landscape bed, I forget about it. I think rats, mice, etc. really, and I'm no expert on this, but I believe it's my belief that they kind of benefit from a large pile that they can really get inside, will somewhat insulate them from the temperatures in the winter and stuff like that. What I'm talking about when I say the leaf litter mess, it's more like a couple of inches of decomposition working for your plants, more so than big old heaps of yard debris. So I think that would be a good way to support the plants without really inviting in a lot of those less mice, rats, etc.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, we've got all sorts of critters around here. We've got raccoons and skunks and possums and coyotes, and we have a lot of wildlife in addition to the birds. And I've been trying to reduce my front lawn. I've been trying to pull up some of the grass and plant native plants. And then the city last year had a program, and I need to find out if they do it. We'll do it this year. It's called No Mow May. So
Yeah.
we're supposed to not clean up the yard and try and let the grass grow for the beneficial insects to get the clovers and things like that. I guess I have a bunch of questions. So my yard is small and I can't fit any more trees in my yard, but for my little native plant area, it was going to be a rain garden, but it gets too dry in the summer. So it's just a native plant. Are there smaller tree or like to help the birds and the beneficial insects? Are bushes okay? Or should I try and plant like a smaller tree that won't get that big? Or
Yep, you've definitely got options there. Lots of native shrubs also have really large impact. Dogwood, there's a lot of different. First of all, Cornus Florida, the flowering dogwood, is more of a tree that gets to about 20 to 25 feet tall. There are some much smaller dogwood shrubs as well that are in that same genus. They're one of those keystone species that have a really large impact, support hundreds of lepidopterans. And those are actually pretty readily available. That's just one example. I don't mean to zero in on dogwood, but I'm just have that on the brain because yeah, and I planted some around my property too. But that website I listed, Native Plant Finder, that includes woody species, so that's trees and shrubs, and then also herbaceous species. So there's lots of shrub options as well that'll stay much smaller if you don't have room for a big tree.
does that website also say where you can get the native plants? Because I know like Cranbrook, they're going to have their annual native plant sale next month, but there aren't that many places that sell the native plants that I've found.
You're right, and that is a big problem, and you oftentimes have to get pretty creative to solve it. There are the native plant specific nurseries. There's a big one around Ann Arbor. I think it's called Wild Type Nursery. I've ordered some stuff from them. Some nurseries will have like a smaller native section, but the reality is that native plants support native insects and wildlife, so they get chewed on a little bit. They may not always look brilliantly green deep into the fall because naturally they're acclimated to the weather here and they drop their leaves at a certain time, all those sorts of things. they haven't been very, very specifically bred to explode with color and be super vibrant at all moments of every day throughout the entire year, like a lot of exotic species that are popular at Home Depot and Lowe's and all the big box stores. So because of that, native plants, I think, aren't always as popular at nurseries, and you do have to dig a little deeper. It can always do some good, especially if you're talking to an individual who owns a nursery, you know, not the customer service at Home Depot, to say, hey, it'd be
Gotcha.
great if you ordered some native plants. I'd love to buy some. And so would my neighbor and my friends in the Sierra Club. You know, hopefully that kind of groundswell movement can push people toward
Yeah, that's a
getting those
great
things
idea.
in so they're available.
Yeah.
I think, Monica, I'm happy to answer more questions, but I want to give some other folks a chance
Yeah, I
as
know.
well.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go
No,
ahead.
no, it's all good. So if anybody else wants to unmute, or I can read to.
Gretchen has her hand up. Me too.
Whichever one of you
Uh,
want to fire
yeah.
away, go ahead.
Chuck?
Gretchen, unmute, ask a question.
One of the plants, small trees that I would recommend is serviceberry or amelanchier.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good native tree. The red bud is an interesting native tree, but it does not, you know, in storms and so on, it doesn't hold up that well. Right now, there's some issues with a lot of the dogwoods. I don't know if it's a borer, or I'm not sure what there is. There are some, so you kind of are it's a little risky to be planting dogwoods to expect that they're going to hold on. But the let's see, amelanchier is my favorite, but there are several kinds, and finding them is a hard thing to do. And don't be worried if you find them and they're very, very small, because actually you can really, a tree grows a lot in its
Mhm.
first years. So starting small is better. It doesn't require as much water. I mean, you want to water it well, but it's not going to, it's going to grow fast for you, especially so start small, and it'll be easier to handle the tree. A lot of the shrubs are planted too deep in their containers, that they've, I think you mentioned that earlier about how the roots grow round and round. And so eventually that can be a big problem for you. But anyway, I have an all shady area, so I'm just enjoying trying to figure out what is going to work in all shady. You know, butterflies and things are not so, they're not so much on shade. So that's all I really wanted to say. I would just Bartlett pears. I wanted to mention that when you were talking about invasive species, they are becoming an invasive species and they're all the Cali, they're what they call the Cali pears, and they're taking over in woodlands.
Yes, yes. And like I mentioned, some states around us, not here in Michigan yet, have made some moves to ban the sale of those pears. They really can take over in woodland areas, all because they briefly put out some pretty nice flowers that come with a very weird, unpleasant smell and cause all these horrible cascading effects.
You know, it's not Bartlett pear, is it? What is it called? Anyway, I've got the wrong name.
Bradford pear is what you were thinking.
Bradford.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. But you also made a really great point that I want to touch on again, just while we're talking about smaller tree or shrub selection. Again, it's always going to come down to right tree, right place. So look first at what your conditions are, not what you want to plant. If you've got shade, like you mentioned, and you have, you know, a wet area in the yard, then you want to find a plant specific to those conditions so that you're not trying to fight nature to make sure it can succeed.
Chuck?
Yeah. As an arborist, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the storms that went through a month ago and what your experience was in Novi, what suggestions you have, any reactions you have to DTE, and what we should be doing in the face of climate change. So it's a wide open question.
Yeah, covering a lot of ground there. The storms were absolutely brutal. Like I kind of mentioned, we spent about a month and a few $100,000 cleaning up down debris, trees in the road, trees blocking sidewalks, all that good stuff. The ice was bad. We actually in Novi had a really, really heavy wet snow as well, right after that week after. And I mean, I work in the same department with the guys that plow that snow. Many of them have been working here 20 to 30 years, and they said it's never been that bad of a push. Such heavy snow, such widespread tree damage. I won't get too in the weeds, but our city council decided to open up our chipping so that residents could bring anything from, we're not just doing the right-of-way trees in front of their home. We'll take whatever debris they have in the backyard, whatever private property stuff, we'll chip that. What I noticed, and a big takeaway that I'm trying to throw up on a billboard, is that our street trees that we've been pruning for several years as part of a routine maintenance pruning program suffered much less damage than trees on private property that maybe had not been maintained in the same manner. So that is just one of those preventative steps that sucks because it's expensive to get trees pruned. And not all companies know what they're doing or are acting in the tree's best interest. So unfortunately, you have to do some homework and kind of know what you're after when you go out to have trees pruned. But it really does make a difference in terms of removing those potentially dangerous branches before they, become a problem for you. So that's kind of my take on storm response there. You touched on climate change too, and a big part of that is, more frequent and more severe storms. So it's not a problem that's going away necessarily. Like I kind of mentioned a few times, that's a big, big, big universe of issues that's very hard to get a handle on. What I am doing as an urban forester is trying to not only replace every tree that we take down, but actually try to add trees so that our overall canopy coverage is increasing rather than decreasing, even in the face of development. That's a pretty tough task, especially when not everyone sees eye to eye with folks like us. Also, still want to plant native species as much as possible, but maybe I want to plant more Kentucky coffee trees where we are on the northern end of their native range. And as temperatures get warmer, they may sort of naturally head up north rather than stuff like, say some of our native evergreens were kind of on the southern edge of their range. So as temperatures increase, they start to do worse and worse and worse in Southeast Michigan. So I'm keeping things like that in mind. That's a good thing for even individuals to consider as well. It's, again, we want to plant trees and plants and create landscapes that last beyond us. So 100 years from now, we got to kind of consider what the climate will look like at that point.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Great.
very much. We have someone from the Greening of Detroit with a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna turn my camera on. I was just thinking how timely it was that this was directed towards birders and the Detroit Audubon, because I'm actually designing a plan right now for migratory birds, which I'm least familiar with. Many things I'm sure I could learn a lot about, but if anyone has any strong thoughts or around species that support migratory birds, especially along the Detroit River, I'm more than happy to put that in consideration. Obviously, we know that having areas for rest for migratory birds is important, especially perpendicular to the river. But any other thoughts? I would love to hear from yourself and anyone else here who are huge birders.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I'd open that up to the greater group. Like I said, I certainly have a strong interest in all types of wildlife. I'm not a birding expert though. So I think that Detroit Audubon would probably be your best bet there. I would parrot to an extent what I have covered in that we want diversity, right? Because even if you find the ideal species to support the largest number of migratory birds, you still want to make sure you're providing for those specialists too. You know, like we've got the Kirtland's warbler that really, really specifically needs jack pine forests to make its living. If you were trying to plant for a whole bunch of birds and, you know, skipped out on the jack pine entirely, and now you don't have any Kirtland's warblers. So, you know, I guess that would be my only take on it, is consult the bird experts, and let's still keep species diversity in mind.
Too bad we can't do jack pine down here.
Yeah, that's not
I
gonna.
totally get your example, but I am excited because the site's large enough to do larger trees like Menace sequoia, which is not native to this time frame, but you know, all the extra structure I think is really helpful. But I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Joanne?
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I live in a condo association development, and I can't plant trees, but I have a friend who has a couple of flowering trees that have been infested, and some of the branches have been coming down. And based on what you said, I'm going to encourage him, instead of cutting those trees down, to maybe save the trunks, because there are insects in the trunks, and the woodpeckers frequent them. And
Oh yeah.
And actually he enjoys watching those birds. If he cuts those trees down, then those woodpeckers and etc. won't come. I never considered, and I'm sure he never considered, trying to leave part of the trees up so that a lunch is still there for those birds. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. The only thing I would think about a little bit there is if you have a pocket of infested, is the word you mentioned, trees over here, for example, and then some healthy ones right over here that have nothing, no problems. I would probably want to ID that bug to make sure it's not something that can easily hop over and cause issues over here with the healthy stuff. But barring that, you know, like you said, it's a great wildlife viewing opportunity, and it's good to support the woodpeckers too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
I guess we're almost out of time. We can take a few more questions, but I wanted to tell you, I had a conversation with Keith before we actually started, and before I started recording. Sorry about that. Forget about the trimming that you've seen around, and I consider it to be excessive that you're seeing them taking half or even maybe 2/3 of the branches off the trees. You've only got the top. So I wondered, Keith, if you could just repeat some of the comments you made, and then I think we have one more question from someone, and then we may call it then.
Yeah, I could wax poetic on this for a while, because I also have done a few tree pruning talks, so I'm going to try to cut to the chase a little bit. Every time you prune a tree, trees don't need you to prune them, right? They were getting along just fine for a very, very long time before people came around with their meddlesome saws. Every time you prune a tree, you are inflicting a wound on it, a wound that tree will then have to seal over. Trees grow pretty gradually, and it takes a long time to seal over a wound, especially if it's larger than a couple inches in diameter. So with that in mind, every single pruning cut you make, or your contractor makes, should be for a reason. Recklessly, and I say that word with the most venom I can conjure, recklessly pruning without any thought for what this particular species natural growth form looks like, whether we're removing too much in a single pruning dose for this tree to support its root system, whether the pruning we're doing is actually making this tree a greater risk to the things around it than if we just left it alone. All of those things need to be going around your head. You need to be taking a full 360-degree view around the tree before a single cut is made. a lot of pruning programs are really just about, we need every branch from 12 feet down to be cut off so that it doesn't impact any signs or people walking on the sidewalk or traffic. That's a very bad approach. Every tree, especially trees of different species, needs to be approached with fresh eyes because they all have unique pruning needs. I shouldn't say needs because, again, trees don't need pruning. They need pruning because we want to live and operate around them. So really, you need to be very thoughtful about the pruning you're doing, why you're doing it, what your intended goal is, which can change as you're kind of going after you make one cut, you know. So again, I could go on and on about this, but I really just want more people and professional arborists even. There are some professional arborists out there that really do, I'll be brazen about it and just say terrible work. They don't have the tree's best interest in mind. They're out there for the paycheck, or they don't really care, or yada yada. Really, every single pruning decision needs to be made with intention, is what I'd focus on there.
Okay. Any final questions for Keith?
Put in a note there. I did come very late. I've been looking forward to this, and unfortunately I got caught up in something. Is there going to be a recording of this?
You know, we have recorded a lot of these, and we do not have anyone to put them up on YouTube. And I'm not the person, I have so much to do right now, I can't do it. So we've been trying to find someone to put them up. In fact, if I give it to Keith, maybe he can put it up himself, but I'm just not able to. And if we find someone to do it, we will put it up. Actually, if you, I put my email in the chat for everyone, and I'll put it in right now, everyone at the meeting. And if you send me an email, I will send you the link and the password, and you can watch it.
Great,
So
thank you,
there it
because
is.
we're having an issue in my town. I am from New Jersey, where even the Environmental Commission does not support any tree saving. And it becomes very frustrating. You know, I go to these meetings and basically I just get stared at when I ask, you know, is there going to be a buffer around before a house goes up, etc. And I even sent this link to a few people on the board because I just feel so hopeless.
Oh, I know exactly what you talk about. And I mean, this has happened to me for years. I've been watching them like on Devastate 696 about 3-4 years ago. It was beautiful on the sides, and they just really cut down everything that was not in a row. And you see them cutting when they're doing work on the highway, they'll cut all the trees down. I know what you mean. It's really tough. And
I mean, I hear constantly the sound of the wood chipping, and it just, but after a few hours, I am so anxious because you know what's going on. And I actually, our town was even approaching people that left natives, and like the speaker said, if you had a dead branch, he'd drag it and put it in. They were giving out tickets for homeowners that did that.
wow. Okay. Well, anyway, if you also contact me, I can give you some ideas of helping to organize. And if your city doesn't have an environmental committee, you can start that. And it only takes a couple people. Sometimes
We do have it.
You
we
do
have them, and they basically don't want trees.
Well, oh boy.
Oh,
Yeah.
I
no.
found that planting young trees is very easy for people to get behind. It's a very easy way to score political points, honestly, if that's, you know, your interest. It's much harder to preserve larger trees. Larger trees obviously have much greater benefits to, you know, providing shade, sequestering carbon, all that good stuff. So I guess, you know, there are numbers out there to support the argument that long-lived, mature trees are exponentially more important environmentally than, you know, 2-inch caliber trees that you just stuck in the ground. So I guess, I mean, I know you've probably repeated a lot of these points, but those figures are out there if you dig. And I would hope that this environmental commission would be open to having their eyes open to, you know, how much more vital these larger trees are than, you know, it's great to pat yourself on the back because you planted a tree on Arbor Day. It's a much greater impact if you can save, you know, 30 mature trees from being cut down for a new, you know, shopping mall.
Well,
Right.
we better.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
we
you.
better.
I
Go
will
ahead.
take any help that you get, that you can give me.
Okay, and maybe we can give you Keith's information and he can talk to your commission via Zoom. That's $1,000, right? Keith? Okay, well, anyway, listen, thank you very much. It has been very informative and best of luck on that job. And it's great to see how well you're actually thriving in this situation, you know? So,
I appreciate it.
yeah.
And I appreciate you guys all coming out to listen.
Thank you for the great
Thank you.
presentation.
Sure, sure.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy full moon. I'll
Yes.
see you all later and thanks for coming. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.